Gorbachev inherited a country in need of reform. Living standards were falling and the economy was failing. Almost immediately, he broke with tradition and took to the streets to talk to his people.
My attitude to ordinary people isn't a game. It is not for show. I treat people with respect because they come from the same sort of place as I do. And I have never forgotten where I came from. I'm just like them.
But the country was locked into a dangerous and expensive competition with America to produce ever more powerful nuclear weapons. Reform would only be possible if he could end the arms race.
He knew how many nuclear weapons had been accumulated. He believed that one of those weapons, they say that if there is a gun in the room in the first act of some play, then it will fire in the final act. So he felt that one day those guns may fire. One day a nuclear holocaust may become a possibility. And he didn't want that.
Gorbachev set out on a series of international summit meetings to negotiate a peace deal. Western leaders had never met a Soviet politician like him. In December 1987, he went to Washington.
Welcome to the United States of America.
He took America, accustomed to seeing Soviet leaders as cold and unapproachable, by storm.
That was very special. He didn't have to do it, and he did it. I am very surprised and pleased.
What do you think of Gorbachev?
The guy is a PR genius.
Away from the showmanship, there were frank diplomatic exchanges. Then Gorbachev and US President Ronald Reagan emerged to announce an historic breakthrough. The two countries had agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals. They signed what became known as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, or INF Treaty.
We can be proud of planting this sapling, which may one day grow into a mighty tree of peace.
Pavel Palashch was Gorbachev's translator in Washington.
Gorbachev said to me, Pavel, do you understand what has happened? This is the first real arms reduction agreement, a real arms disarmament agreement rather than just arms control agreement. This is a real achievement for us and the Americans.
Gorbachev became a hero in the West, but at home it was a different story.
It actually undermined Gorbachev, and it began the process whereby he seemed to be giving away too much to the West and getting too little back in return. It meant that Soviet citizens as a whole began to trust him rather less.
He chose not to see the gathering storm clouds. He talked of perestroika, or reform, and glasnost, meaning greater freedom of speech. He introduced free elections and abolished the Communist Party's monopoly of power. But his reform program was not delivering what he had promised. Food queues grew and the shops were emptier. The Soviet people began to lose faith in him. Elsewhere in the Soviet bloc, the people of communist Eastern Europe saw an opportunity and rose up against their Soviet leaders. Gorbachev refused to send in the Red Army. By the winter of 1989, the infamous Berlin Wall, symbol of Soviet rule, was being torn down. Back in Moscow, Soviet citizens felt betrayed. Gorbachev had given away their empire and with it their position in the world. In the eyes of many of his people, he'd become a Soviet villain. In August 1991, while he was out of Moscow, the blow fell. News seeped out that there'd been a coup. Gorbachev was held under house arrest in his holiday home by communist hardliners. There was fighting between Gorbachev's supporters and groups opposed to him. It was 3 days before the coup was defeated. A shaken Gorbachev returned to Moscow and tried to take up again the reins of power. But too many people had lost confidence in him. "18 months later, he resigned. In the West, he was given the Nobel Prize for his contribution to world peace, but in his own country, he'd made too many enemies.
Gorbachev was the first leader in the Soviet Union to introduce reforms and then to have the courage to follow them through.
Today, Gorbachev lives quietly in Moscow, running a political and economic think tank. He believes he could still be in power if he'd chosen to be.
I had absolute power. If my ideal had just been to keep power, then today you'd be talking, if you were allowed to the General Secretary of the Communist Party. But that's not what I wanted.